Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Graduate Dentist Podcast, your go-to guide through real-world dentistry and a community amongst graduates. My name is Erica Huynh, and thank you so much for tuning in to another episode. This is a reminder that you can now follow along the video by watching on Spotify or by subscribing to our new YouTube channel. Unless, of course, you are driving, in which case, eyes on the road, please. Please drive safe, and you can continue pretending like I'm sitting in your backseat, just gas bagging and keeping you company for your drive to work. Now, this is a super fun episode that we have this week with Dr. Annalene Weston, who is a practicing dentist and a dental-legal consultant for our friends over at Dental Protection. As graduates, the idea of patient complaints, of getting sued, of being deregistered, having conditions placed on us is a real fear and can be really daunting. Dentistry has consistently been in the top 3 for the most complained about professions, and we all, either ourselves or know someone who has experienced the anxiety of receiving a call from AHPRA. And so in this episode, Annalene and I break it all down and talk through it, from the very real experiences that people go through and ways to work through it, to the daily phone calls that she receives from acutely distressed dentists. We talk about the common anxieties and the misconceptions that we often have, particularly new grads, about disclosing their current situation or scenarios out of fear of being dobbed in, which can actually at times impede on our ability to get advice or to seek help when needed. We explore every scenario from patient death and litigation to a bad Google review. We talk about how AHPRA regulates and manages complaints, and we dive into tools that we can implement to minimize our risk of patient complaints in the first place. I love how honest and transparent we were in this conversation. Annalene has this incredible ability to inject light and humor in these otherwise really stressful situations. This honestly felt like such a warm hug, and I think you guys will really appreciate it as well and feel the reassurance and the validation knowing that you were never alone in these circumstances and situations. Speaking of never being alone, we have officially launched our Graduate Dentist Discord community server, and in just a week we have over 200 members, which is absolutely insane to me. It is bustling with activity, and it is so wholesome and so encouraging seeing how supportive everyone is of one another, and I am so proud of this community that we are collectively creating, where we celebrate each other's wins and we resonate with each other's struggles. It's always been our mission statement to uplift one another, to help each other out, and to rise together. And so, if you want to be a part of it, if you want to join the family, then you can find our invite link to the Discord in the show notes or on social media. Otherwise, I hope you thoroughly enjoy this conversation with Annalene. Welcome to the Graduate Dentist Podcast. Thank you for joining and spending your time with me despite your busy, hectic schedule.
We're all busy, Erica. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
I'm really excited to dive into your world, Annalene, as a dental legal consultant. Something that I talk about a lot on our podcast is that I love exploring all the different avenues people can go down. It's not just clinical dentistry. People find all different ways of, finding their place in our industry. And I'm really curious to explore your journey. But, we touched just before we started recording about, things we were good at in school, maths, English. Neither of us apparently were maths people. But I wonder, were you part of like the Justice Youth Group, or, was this kind of this advocacy, mental well-being, this space, was it something that you were always passionate about?
No, not really.
Yeah.
When I went to do dentistry, and I think we all do dentistry for different reasons, don't we? Why did you go into dentistry?
Why did I go into dentistry? I think it's a not uncommon story that people share where it's a good combination of there's the healthcare side of it, there's the patient interaction, being able to socialize, being able to be creative, working with your hands, a bit of a mix of everything, I think.
Brilliant. Me too.
Yeah.
So all
Yeah.
those things. But I was also really interested in the law, and specifically in ethics. Is like, I really love ethics. What a dog, but I do. And then I remember when I was at dental school, Dental Protection came to speak to us about law and ethics just before we graduated. And this is something that we do in Australia as well. We come and speak to people about law and ethics, doing something called an about to graduate presentation, just to give you an idea of some of the challenges that you're going to experience. So we come and do that in Australia too. But I remember the gentleman who presented, and I was just really interested in what he had to say. And then when I first graduated and I was working under the NHS, dentistry wasn't what I thought it was going to be. Now, I do need to qualify that by saying dentistry in the NHS in 1999, when I graduated, a long time ago now, was not what I thought it was going to be. So within 6 months of graduating, I was seeing 50 patients a day.
Wow, my goodness.
So we'd start at 8 or 8:15. I finish at 5:36. You'd have 15 minutes for an adult checkup and clean, 5 minutes for a checkup and clean on a child, 5 minutes for a checkup and clean on patients who were partially dentate. Now think about it. Think about what can you do in 5 minutes?
Say hello to my patient, ask them how their day was,
Right.
lean them back in the chair, and then like, okay, you can sit back up.
Absolutely. So
Mhm.
can you meaningfully do a
Mm,
comprehensive assessment, update
absolutely
someone's
not.
medical history, write
No.
comprehensive clinical notes?
Mm.
And so I found it quite panicking because I was always running late and I would worry for hours and hours and hours, disproportionate amount of time about what had I missed? What was I missing? What was I doing wrong? And this led to me essentially suffering with what I now understand was burnout, though I didn't understand that at the time, which led to me coming to Australia, which led to me ultimately making the decision that I needed to make a decision about what I was going to do. So I think you hit this point between 5 and 10 years post grad, and it's going to be different for different people, where you have this go home or go hard moment. So it takes a couple of years to embed your skills. They say 10,000 hours, right? And depending on how much clinical time you did at dental school is going to depend when you hit 10,000 hours. It's somewhere between 4 and 7 years post grad. So at this point, you become like a master of your trade. Brilliant. But you become aware that other people are achieving mastery in different things. And I think that particularly recent graduates of your generation, Erica, sorry to sound like an old lady, but I
Like,
think,
back in your day.
which I am, yeah, when I used to walk to school in the snow, yeah, I know.
Not at all, yeah.
But I think you're under a lot more pressure with social media than we were. But certainly you become aware other people are placing implants and other people are doing ortho and other people are doing all these things. And you feel like if I don't start to do something, I'm going to be left behind. And all practitioners hit that moment. Now, I would say on that, just as an aside, it's really important that you're on your own journey and you don't worry about what other people are doing, because you've got to grow and develop at your own speed. And you also need to remember that what you see on social media is not a reflection of people's actual practice. It's a reflection of some curated aspects of their practice on some days. And I have a lot more respect for people who show their failures than I ever will for people who show all their successes on the social media. So anyway, I hit this point and do I specialize? Do I buy a practice? I quite like perio. So did I do a perio specialty? Blah, blah, blah. And because of my nature and personality, you probably don't remember this because you're too young. But there used to be a button on Google called I Feel Lucky.
Oh, I know, I remember that. I do remember that. Where did that
I don't know.
go?
So I put in specialist in periodontics or study to be specialist in, and then I pressed I Feel Lucky, and it came up with University of Sydney Faculty of Law, Masters of Health. And it was because there was a big perio case, and one of the people on it, a guy called a QC called Ian, or he'd be a KC now, of course, called Ian Freckleton, was teaching on that course. So therefore, the course came up. And I thought, always wanted to do this ever since that time at Dental Protection came and spoke to us. And so I went and did law and bumped into a completely different lane, if you see what I mean. Moved away. I still do practice quite rarely, but I do. But I just bumped into a completely different path in dentistry just from pressing the Google I Feel Lucky button, which
Got
tells you that
lucky.
I'm reckless. I'm
Yeah.
not suggesting anyone else do that.
But you found your place though.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very, very
And
much so.
And then you gave me such a good, just like rundown, I guess, insight into your life and what's led you to where you are today. But I want to unpack it a little bit further. And you mentioned that it all started with that talk when dental protection came to you whilst you were in final year and they spoke to you about ethics. And this was something that you were passionate about. Can we break down the term ethics, ethical dentistry? What was it specifically that they spoke to you about that piqued your interest? What does it mean?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Erica. And I think it causes a lot of people confusion because what people think ethics is and what ethics is, I guess, might be two different things. So, broadly, the world is structured by laws. And if you think of laws as being like the bricks in a wall, you can see the edges, they're quite solid, and they're not immovable, but they're solid. I should say the laws are movable. The laws are absolutely, it's also open to interpretation, but that's a story for another day. But the problem is when you put all the bricks together, there's always gaps. And ethics is the mortar that sits in the gaps between the bricks. Ethics is something which can be very personal and it can be based on your moral values. It can be based on how you were raised. There can be religious aspects, social aspects, environmental aspects to ethics. But it's essentially that guiding compass or that north light when there is no law. We often have people say to us, Annalene, legally, do I have to give this patient a refund? Now, there is no law, Erica, that says this is the law about refunding patients. It doesn't exist. Okay. So that's not the point. The point is looking at the circumstances surrounding that patient's treatment. Not do I have to, but should I? Or is it appropriate for me to? Because just because you don't have to do something, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. And that's ethics. It's that bit that fills the gaps, that tells us what we should do when there is no specific law or guidance that's mandating our behavior. And that's why it's so fascinating, because it's open to interpretation.
Yeah. There isn't a right answer to it, is there?
There isn't, but there also is.
Mm.
Because if you think about, there's lots of different ways of looking at it. So one of the things that we talk about dental protection is called the mother test or the daughter test. So if this was my mum, what would I think was appropriate? If this was my child, what would I think was appropriate? If this was my best friend or my lover, what would I think was appropriate? Do I think it's okay they were treated like that? Regardless of any risks and warnings they were given or whatever they may or may not sign, if my mum was in this situation right now, how would I want her clinician to treat her? If you apply that test, your ethics, it very quickly becomes apparent what is appropriate, regardless of what those bricks say. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So, in this space, are you educating young practitioners? Are you teaching them how to be ethical dentists? Are you helping guide them in these situations where they're unsure what they should do? Like, how do we implement that into practice?
Absolutely, we're always guiding, not
Mm,
just young practitioners, Erica, of
mm,
course,
yeah.
because what I was going to say by that is that you'll face challenge at all points of your career, and it isn't always obvious or easy, particularly when someone's hurt your feelings. So there's something called the Karpman drama triangle. So, little triangle, 3 points. Point one is somebody called the victim. And that often, when a patient comes in the surgery, is the patient. They're suffering. And then there's something called the rescuer. And a lot of practitioners naturally fall into this rescuer role. We love to rescue. Oh, I've never been able to have a tooth successfully extracted. Well, hold my beer, and
Yeah.
and that's us. It's who we are. We're healthcare professionals. Okay.
Mhm.
And then the third corner of the triangle is something called the persecutor. And often patients have had that bad experience, that person who's hurt them in the past. So we come in as the rescuer to heal, to help. Problem is, the second that something goes wrong, the triangle flips and the patient becomes the persecutor. And all of a sudden, you become the victim because you become responsible for every terrible thing that's ever happened to that person. And I don't know if that's happened to you yet, but if it does, you will find those patients that you stay late for, work through lunchtime for, discount, give your entire being to, and they seem really nice. And then one little thing goes wrong and they flip and they turn on you like some savage werewolf. And it's terrifying. So that, I think, is when it's really hard to know the right thing to do because ultimately, deep in your heart, you feel really wronged. And that's where people like me come in because not only can I take the emotion out of it because they haven't actually hurt my feelings. I understand why they've hurt your feelings, of course, but they haven't hurt my feelings. But also, I can help you just take a step back and see that if, for example, you've been sucked into that Cartman drama triangle, that you're playing a role in that person's life and help you step to the side and go back into the role that you should be playing, which is healthcare professional. not whatever person they've got sucked into their drama right at this moment in time. And it might be that you're listening to this and you're thinking, oh, I've got no idea what that crazy woman's talking about. But I promise you, unfortunately, a moment will come in your practice career when that happens and you feel that triangle flip on its side and you go, whoa, okay, what just happened there? And that's why people like me exist, because those emotive things, most people know the right thing, Erica. But when you're hurt, when someone's being mean and it's not justified, that's when it's hard. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to perhaps later in the episode diving into perhaps even the scenario that, you hinted at, which I think a lot of us experience day in, day out, and particularly as new grads where we are the people pleasers. I hear a lot of times new grads feeling like they get stepped over or and you
Stepped
can
on.
very yeah, sorry, yeah, stepped on and stepped over and trampled on and smushed into the ground. But it's a common situation we hear, and we can see how that could very much escalate into, that triangle that you were discussing
Sure.
where it's all flipped. But moving deeper into that topic then, so you were saying how you were first exposed to, I guess, this idea when you were in your final year, and then you talked about practicing under the NHS. Did you experience those kind of scenarios whilst you were there, and like those 50 patients a day? That shaped your attitude then wanting to dive into it?
Um, I now know, with the benefit of hindsight, I suffered with something called moral injury. So moral injury is something that can feed into burnout. So there's two strands. So moral distress, which is something that a number of particularly young practitioners experience, but older practitioners get it too, is where the gap between the type of dentistry that you want to provide that person and what they actually get. So the bigger the gap, the more distress you feel. So think about the first time you did a class 2 composite and how hard you tried and you put the rubber dam on and all these things and you've got the wedge and the ring and then you adjust the inclination. Then you take the rubber dam off and it looked crap. And I'm not
It looks like
suggesting
a
that's no
potato.
value statement on you,
Yeah.
Erica, but and it didn't look like you wanted it to. And it didn't look like
Yeah.
the ones on Instagram. And maybe it had an open contact and maybe you had to redo it. And you felt bad about yourself because that wasn't what you wanted to give that patient. It's the same when you first do molar endo and how hard it is. And you're trying and you're trying and you're trying to get it right. And you're like, why can't I get to the apices? Everyone else can get to the apices. Why can't I? It takes time, telling, and no one can get there initially. It's okay. That's, anyway, that feeling is called moral distress. Now, a lot of, as I said, recent graduates have that experience and they just spend most of their time feeling a bit bad about themselves, feeling like, I'm not really sure I'm safe to be here. I'm not really sure I'm good. Am I good enough? And then imposter syndrome starts sitting on your shoulder as well, telling you that you don't belong. It's a really horrible space to be in as a recent graduate. So I was also suffering with something called moral injury, which is where the environment that you're in is prohibiting or preventing you from being able to give the treatment that you wanted. So because I had these really short appointments, I felt that I was rushing people in and out and not, so people who were really scared weren't getting any more time or care. Well, they were, but it was at the expense of the people in the waiting room. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was more that just general feeling of wrongness. And I think what was hard was initially I thought I was the wrong because no one else from my year seemed to be having any issues with the system. They all seemed to be coping really well. Whereas I just felt like a bad dentist and a bad person all the time. Like, I'm just bad. I just can't get this done. And what have I missed? What have I missed? What have I missed? And so that probably not that encouraged me to leave dentistry and leave the country, but
Not just leave dentistry, leave the country.
absolutely, gotta don't know anything about herbs. But I
Yeah.
think it was more those experiences are really what piqued my desire to support the mental and emotional well-being of
Mm,
practitioners, which my role at Dental Protection really, really, really lets me do. So that's actually where the passion lay. Ethics is
yeah.
great, and I can help you with ethics, but it's that more where my passion really, and that's the thing that Dental Protection
Yeah.
really affords me. Yeah.
And I think that's where we share very similar values in the whole point of the graduate dentist is working in a very similar space. Everything that you said at the beginning, even when you're talking about comparison and you being on your own journey and not getting sucked into the world of what other people are posting, that's everything that we stand for and advocate for on the podcast. And so I'm really excited to have you on board, Annalene, and sharing your experiences and your thoughts on that. I wonder, you said in hindsight, you look back into your time on the NHS and you realize what you're experiencing back then. Did you ever figure out why you felt that way and your peers and your colleagues didn't?
I think I just got there early. If
Mm.
I'm honest, I think I
Mm-hmm.
just got there early. I think ultimately they all burnt out. I think probably everyone was feeling it. I was just more honest about it because I've always been my authentic and true self.
Yeah.
Shall we?
Yeah.
Whoops. Yeah, I think I was more honest about it. And I think as well, probably the environment I was working in meant I got to that 50 patients more quickly because I was working in a very busy practice in an area of quite low socioeconomic area, an area of high need. I wasn't working in a city where there were many more practices. So I think I reached that pressure point more quickly and quite young in my career. So not saying that I would be able to see, I'm far too old to see 50 patients a day now. Wouldn't have the appetite for it. But certainly as you get hit that 10,000 hours and you become more skilled and things become easier. Everything just becomes a bit easier. It's like when you first learn to drive and it's really hard. And then after a while, it just becomes second nature. There is an element of that mastery too. So I think I was just young to hit that level. And the type of patients I was seeing had a really high area of need. Whereas I think some of my colleagues were in cities, they just hadn't got to that point yet. But certainly, I went back to the UK for a friend's wedding, oh gosh, 5 years later. And I could certainly see then, no, it would have been a bit later actually. I could certainly see then that my colleagues had got there. And they were actually a little bit jelly that I'd taken a step to the side and I was studying law. Because the other thing is, it's very easy to go and live on the other side of the world and change direction when you don't have dependents and you don't have significant debt. When you have families, when you've bought a practice, it can be super hard to make that change. But I was still just me, so I only had myself at risk.
Yeah, for sure. And so you said you moved to Australia, so you moved to Australia to study law.
I moved to Australia to have a holiday. I
Oh,
ran out of
okay.
money,
Yeah,
of
and
course, and
just
had
got
to get it
stuck here.
and had to get yeah, pretty much, and had to get a
Yeah,
job. And there's
yeah,
only one way I really know how to make money, and that's pulling teeth, right?
yeah.
So I got a job working for Dental Health Services Victoria, and I found I was really happy there because I wasn't having to see 50 patients a day. And it was very values based and it was very moral. And I really felt like I was helping because when you are struggling with practice or you are suffering with any type of moral injury or distress, one thing that's really helpful is just to remember your why. Why do I do this? What are my values? So ultimately, I mentioned it earlier, we're healthcare professionals, we're helpers, we're healers. So if you feel like you're not helping anyone, that's a horrible way to feel. Whereas when I worked for Dental Health Services Victoria, I felt like I was really helping and giving back. So it really sparked my passion for dentistry again. And I continued to practice for some years, 5 or so years, but then reached that age, that sort of, I was 30. And so I'd been graduated 7 years. I reached that time and I was like, right, what am I going to do next? Because I can be an associate for life and there's nothing wrong with that. But I was just aware it was that go home or go hard moment. What do I want to be when I grow up? I spent my 20s developing and mastering dentistry. What was
Yeah,
I going to spend my 30s doing?
and that's where it took you.
Interesting, hey?
Dentistry, particularly as a new grad, is stressful enough as it is. And so, if there's anything we can do to minimize all the external factors we need to think about, I'm all for it. Nothing is more daunting than the prospect of a patient complaint, especially in our early years. Thanks to Dental Protection Limited, I know I can sleep a little easier. Now, I've been working alongside DPL for years now, since my student days, and they have always been such huge supporters of everything I do, including the launch of the Graduate Dentist podcast. And so I know when push comes to shove and the time calls for it, I can trust DPL to have my back and to be in my corner. With a team of experienced dental legal consultants and an abundance of resources, including webinars, their own podcasts, magazines, which, by the way, I've written some articles for, you know DPL's got you covered. If you signed up as a student, you are automatically covered for your first 18 months of practice for free. Thank you, DPL, for always looking after me and for supporting the Graduate Dentist podcast. Absolutely. It makes me think of a lot of things. And I think a point that you mentioned that I really like is in those moments of moral injury or in those moments of burnout, coming back to figuring out your why and realizing that that inner self of you is not being fulfilled or not being nurtured. And that explaining why you're not feeling fulfilled or feeling satisfied or accomplished in your day to day. Hey.
Yeah, it's important. Your
Mm.
sense of purpose shouldn't be underestimated.
So you found your drive, I guess your new passion that was going to take you through this next chapter of your life in your 30s, where you became a dental legal consultant with DPL. Is that then the next chapter of your life? What did your day to day look like then in helping dentists? What did it become from going from an associate to entering this new space?
That's a great question. So, initially, when I was putting myself through my law degree, because I had to self-fund, um, I was working part-time as a dentist. So I did my law master's part-time as well. But I quickly worked out, because dental degrees are really hard. Like, I know it sounds a bit like Captain Obvious, but we don't realize how hard it is because it's our normal. So I started doing this law master's part-time. I was like, there was a lot of reading, but I had this. I got this, mate. So I started doing more hours in practice and I moved to doing my course full time because, of course, I did. And then graduated and I had all these different job options available to me, but I did something completely, yeah, I'm going to say completely stupid. And I moved back up to Queensland to be with my boyfriend because I
Oh,
loved him.
yeah.
Yeah. We're now married with 2
Oh,
children,
okay.
so it
No, so
wasn't a
it worked
terrible
out. Okay.
wasn't
Yeah.
like a completely terrible decision. But bearing in mind how much I'd invested in my career and my education and, extra qualifications, I moved up to Queensland probably with no possibility of using this law degree. But I loved him and it just seemed like the right thing to do. And so I was moving up here, went back into practice full time, and I got a job on one of the health complaint commissions, which were the bodies that preceded AHPRA. Okay, so prior to AHPRA, there were 84 state and territory boards, little boards that all fitted together like a jigsaw. And the problem was that if you had a complaint in the midwifery board of, I don't know, East Hobart, you'd get a different outcome to the midwifery board of West Hobart. And that's one of the reasons that AHPRA came into being, to ensure consistency. So I was working on this Health Complaints Commission, which was mostly dealing with dust and noise pollution complaints from the local hospital being redeveloped. So, totally got me going. Um, and then got married and went to a dental protection presentation. And one of the dental legal consultants said to me, "Are you still interested in this type of work?" Why, yes, I am. And so I had 2 job interviews. I was pregnant at the time, which is never a great time to be changing jobs. So I moved to Brisbane with my then husband and 6-week-old baby and started a job with dental protection with a 10-week-old baby. So initially I only worked, 2 days a week for dental protection. And then obviously had the baby because, you kind of can't like leave them unsupervised. There's some rules around having children.
Something
And
like inconvenient rules, right?
totally. And so I started off like that. And then
Mm.
obviously the baby grew into a toddler and then another baby came along, which isn't unprecedented. And
Mhm.
then we kind of juggled our lives. So initially Matt and I had no support. So we used to both work a 5-day fortnight. So 2 days one week, 3 days the next, and then be at home the other day. So I did a mix of dental protection and practice and some practice on the weekends, and he did his job part-time. And then, yeah, but we literally had to do that things at occasions where we'd meet at the local McDonald's and one of us would have the kids asleep in the back of the car and we'd swap cars. and then the other one would go off to work. It's ridiculous the way that you have to juggle when you're both working, but you get that. And it builds resilience.
Yeah. And so then what does your day-to-day look like as a dental legal consultant? What does that entail?
Okay, well, so I'm in a slightly different position because I head up the advisory team now. So I have an amount of managerial responsibilities, which is about as much fun as punching yourself in the face because I'm not a massive fan of spreadsheets and budgets. But you learn these skills, right? But actually being a dental legal consultant, you start off, the most important role that we have is the call sessions. So the time on the phone. So Dental Protection offers a 24-hour emergency service, but I'd encourage you not to ring at midnight unless it is an emergency, unless you want to be speaking to the cranky version of myself. But our working day is quite long because we cover the whole of Australia. We come on at 8 o'clock Brisbane time and drop off at 7 o'clock Brisbane time to make sure that we're covering Western Australia. So we take turns at covering the calls rather than be on for 11 hours because, again, you're not going to get the best version of yourself there. Um, and you answer the phone to people with queries. The majority of the people who ring up are acutely distressed. Not everyone. Some people are just ringing up because they can't find the infection control guidelines or where do I find and that's fine. They're obviously here to help with everything. But the majority of people who ring up are acutely distressed, either because something bad has happened in their practice. That can vary from a patient death, which is obviously the most extreme. And we tend to find those practitioners require quite a lot of emotional support, which is completely understanding. And we have things like a confidential counselling service that's available 24 hours a day and things like that. So we have additional peripheral supports for those for all practitioners, but those practitioners in particular need those things. It can be that something's gone wrong in your treatment. So I've had many a practitioner ring me up in tears. I've just pushed a root in the sinus. What did you tell the patient? I haven't told them yet. They're still in the chair. And I'm like, okay, is someone with them? Are they by themselves? And then we walk the practitioner through the next steps, both the immediate steps and then the long-term steps. And we kind of talk them down off the ledge. Sometimes it's because they've received a letter of complaint or a letter from AHPRA. Or these days, bad Google reviews are causing an extreme amount of distress, which I completely understand why they're upsetting. It goes back to that people we've really tried for attacking us. But in the scale of patient death, Google review, it's interesting how distressed these practitioners, they can be as distressed as someone where a patient's just died.
Yeah.
Yeah, really
It's
interesting.
crazy. I really want to break that down a little bit more, Annalene, because the other day I was talking to my boss actually, and it was a really interesting conversation. I said, you know what? I have an interview coming up with Annalene. I think she'd be the perfect person to break this down for me. But we're essentially trying, exactly like you said, trying to put things into context or um what's the word? Like relativity. And it's exactly like what you said about, fatality, patient death versus a bad Google review, right? And how things can escalate. And in terms of, is it just a complaint? Does that become something more? When does legal action get involved? When does it go to court? When are you being sent to jail, right? Like,
Yeah.
but as a new grad who's never experienced any of it, a bad Google review, you can think like, okay, I'm going to be deregistered and I'll never be able to practice again. It's the end of the world. I guess we don't have that context. We don't have that relativity. But as someone who does this day in, day out, that sees the full spectrum of things, can you kind of take us through from, I guess, and not to discredit, people's experiences or anything, but I guess
Because they're
go
their
from,
own.
yeah, no, right? But going from, I guess, what you would say are, I get, yeah, objectively, like minor encounters and how that would be managed and then escalating that all the way to the most severe, I guess, cases and situations that you've had to encounter and help manage.
Sure. So you have to remember that patients have got the right to complain. And it's not like it is a consumer right, but just start from the beginning, wind right back. When you talk about people's rights and you talk about, people say, I bought this, or they try and make their filling like a good or a service, like a toaster. And while physically you could argue that it is, dentistry holds a really interesting position because we are neither a good nor a service. We're something called a credence good. And this is where that morality and that ethics comes in. Credence goods are goods built on trust. Uh, Religious leaders, religion is a credence good. Isn't that extraordinary? Education, in many ways, is a credence good because you are buying a good and a service, like a filling is a good and the service is the consultation, but it's the trust. What you're buying is trust that that person is doing the right thing for you and by you. Okay. So you're buying trust when you come to the patient, when the patient comes to you, sorry. So if you breach that trust in any way, shape, or form, morally, that person has the right to complain. Of course they do. Of course they do. You've broken their trust. Whether you really have or they just think you have, they've got the right to raise that. So it's nothing personal. So push that emotion to the side. And oftentimes it's a breakdown in communication. So at a low level, a patient will complain to the practice and say, this filling's broken, or this filling another dentist had to redo this root canal, or I've got pain after treatment. Things like that are often really, really easily resolved by getting the relevant information. So if they've seen someone else, getting a copy of the other practitioner's records and x-rays, and engaging with the patient, usually writing a really nice letter, which we help you with. We're amazing ghostwriters, saying, I'm really sorry that you had this terrible experience, and then arranging a solution. So acknowledging their hurt, not saying, I'm sorry I hurt you, because that doesn't mean you did, okay? I'm sorry you feel this way. I'm sorry this thing happened. I completely understand. Put myself in your shoes, and this is my solution. Sometimes the solution is just the apology. Sometimes the solution's a refund. But the majority of complaints can be very easily resolved by a timely and kind, well-worded letter. And they go away. Then there's a percentage that don't. The most common place that they escalate to is the regulator. So I'm going to call it AHPRA, but it depends what state you're in. If you're in New South Wales, it's Dental Council New South Wales. If you're in Queensland, it's the OHO. But AHPRA is always there
Okay.
in the background.
Is AHPRA the umbrella?
Yeah, or the bedrock. It depends which way you look at it. It either underpins or it overarches. It's more underpins everything, really.
Okay.
But normally you have to walk through a different door. So in New South Wales, you have to walk through the AHPRC to get to the Dental Council New South Wales. In Queensland, you have to walk through the OHO to get to AHPRA. But it's always there. It's like I say, it's a bedrock. It's always there. Dentistry is this year the third most complained about profession off the top of my head out of all of the 14 or 15 registered health professions. There are times we've been the most complained about profession. We've never dropped out the top 3, and that's by percentage, okay? So AHPRA then receives the complaint, the notification. The first thing that the dental practitioner normally knows is they get a phone call from AHPRA, which tells them, it scares the jubba-jubbas out of them, and that tends to be when they ring up really, really upset. So we'll just talk them down off the ledge because nothing's going to happen this minute. We get all the information in, and we help people draft what's called their submission, because what you need to understand is just because a patient says all these things about you, it doesn't mean that they're believed. That's their understanding. You have the right of reply, and we help you with that. And we help you provide your records in a way that, help you format everything. And the majority, probably around 70% at the moment, it changes. That's why I'm sort of saying it's around, because it changes year to year, month to month, but around 70% of complaints to AHPRA are dismissed. Okay? So your odds are in your favour.
You guys write a reply to AHPRA.
We help you with that.
And then AHPRA, I guess, compares what the patient has said, what we have replied with, and then they either decide to dismiss it or take further action.
Correct. And your clinical records become critical because your clinical records are actually, in a sense, a legal document. So if your time and date's down to clinical records, say you had a conversation with a patient and the patient says, they never told me this, and you say, I did, and here are my records. We use slightly different words, but AHPRA can see that and your version of events will be preferred. So that's a legal way of saying it's all written down. What kind of a maniac would falsify records at a dental appointment about a conversation that was never had on the outcome that the patient, just in case the patient made a complaint? No one. So it's accepted that that's true. The ones that aren't dismissed, the commonest outcome is something called a caution, which is a bit like getting points on your driver's license. No one can see it, but you wouldn't want to get too many. Okay. Or another one is something called conditions and undertakings. So they can look like the condition is that you can't do any endo until you undertake 12 hours of CPD and endo and you get signed off by a specialist as safe. And those conditions will be visible on your registration. Around 11% of practitioners, dental practitioners across Australia, get conditions as a consequence of an AHPRA notification. So 1 in 25 practitioners gets an AHPRA notification, and 11% of that 1 in 25 get conditions. Okay, so it's a really small number if you think about it. It's a really small number. If you and I were better at maths, we could even come up with what that percentage is, but we're totally not. So, and then, yes, there are those more severe ones where people get suspended. I think 3 to 5 dental practitioners are suspended annually. Normally, to be suspended, you have to be deemed to be a significant risk to the public. So you have to be a worry that you're going to hurt people. If you do a rubbish endo, you're not really a risk to the public. It's one bad endo, right?
Would those usually be like repeat offenses?
Yeah, and criminal
Mm,
acts as well.
mm,
Criminal
mhm.
acts. And so obviously there's like this concept of something called a fit and proper person to be a dental practitioner or any health practitioner. And there's certain things. And again, it comes down to those ethics, right? So ethically, fit and proper people don't lie and cheat. They don't take drugs before they go to work. They don't treat patients drunk. They don't inject them with the wrong things. They don't, they don't rip them off. They don't defraud the health funds. And I know, again, that sounds really obvious, but that should give you an idea of the type of things that can lead to suspension. They don't touch patients up. Like that's considered to be a fit and proper person. So when you step outside of that being a fit and proper person, that's when the regulator's going to say, hey, you're not, we need to just put a pin in this and we need to get some, because remember, all suspension actually is the dental board saying, stand down until we understand whether you are safe to practice. That's what it actually is. Oftentimes they'll make a decision that you're not, but that's actually all suspension is they're just saying, everybody just cool their jets. Let's not keep seeing people. Let's just work out you're safe, because ultimately their obligation is to the public. It's not to the practitioner. So ratios, you've got a 1 in 25% chance of receiving, or 4% chance of receiving a notification annually. And then you have, if you do get one, you've got about a 10% chance something's going to come of it. So but people really freak out when they receive one.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I feel like that's the biggest concern. I don't imagine anything more terrifying than, receiving a scary phone call from AHPRA or receiving a letter from them. Um, a lot of times people talk about worrying about things going on record.
What do you mean
And
by that? With the regulator?
yeah, and I guess just unpacking that, right? What can be recorded, what things, are, I think just unpacking that idea, right? A lot of people are worried about things being put under their blacklisted or
Oh, you
things
don't
are
get
under their name.
blacklisted,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
everything goes on record.
Mhm.
So even complaints that have got no merit, so we call those, like, there's something called a vexatious complaint. Now, vexatious has a really specific legal definition, but for the purposes of our chat, Erica, we're just going to say vexatious is a complaint that's got no basis. Okay? So if I give you an example, I helped a recent graduate recently with an infection control complaint. Okay, now, that's not what the patient calls it. The patient said that they caught a dry socket after an extraction from the surgery because the surgery was dirty and the dentist didn't wash her hands. That's an infection control complaint. Now, that has no merit because we all know you can't catch a dry socket, okay? And as a consequence, the dental board wasn't worried about that. AHPRA wasn't worried about that. What they wanted to know is, what are your infection control processes? So the practitioner had to provide her infection control processes, the practice manual, her 5 moments of hand hygiene certificate, when the last time she did infection control CPD was. So if you're only in the first 12 months of graduation, generally you're current with that. But once you get a couple of years out, there's an expectation that you need to update, as well as going on, how to place implants. You need to be doing some infection control CPD. Doesn't mean you have to attend a course. The ADA does some amazing infection control webinars, but some sort of update regularly. It's not mandated how frequently, but generally every year or two, and every time there's a big change. So you'd know there's been a big change in the infection control updates at the start of 2024. Now's a real good time to be looking to find some infection control CPD. Word to the wise there. So that's what she had to provide. And of course, the matter was dismissed, which is called an NFA, no further action. But that will always be on her record. It doesn't matter. It's not held against you. It becomes a problem if that practitioner has 10 or 15 or 20. I caught this from that person. Then the dental board or the AHPRA would be saying, or AHPRA would ask the dental board to go in and have a look. What's going on here? Why do we keep getting infection control complaints about this premises? So yeah, they have a record of all your complaints, but that's okay. It's not held against you until you have a whole heap. Then it becomes a problem.
What about for those more minor complaints where they haven't reached out to AHPRA, haven't reached out to the dental board, and it's just an email that you've received, like that's been addressed to your practice,
Mhm.
or it's been a patient that's come in that's angry, and you yourself have decided to go, speak to DPL, for
Mhm.
example, for advice.
Mhm.
Does that go on the record with DPL, and is there any consequences of that?
Yeah, sure, but not the way that
Mm.
you think. So in the same way that you have to keep records of every conversation you have with a patient, every consultation, we have to keep records every time we have a conversation with you, because we're liable for any advice that we give you. So when I said about people ring up and they say, "Oh, this patient has got is I've just pushed the root in the sinus," and I give you advice. If you follow that advice and the patient sues you, that's on us. You're not going to be privately sued. That's what insurance is for. We will carry the costs and bear the costs of that. Okay. So it's really important, because we're held liable for every piece of advice that we give, that we keep a phone log. This can become what's called a case. And a case is where the policy has been activated. And that's not just for dental protection, that's for any insurer. So advice is just advice. But if the policy is activated, so that means that you are being sued and it's going to cost the reinsurer money, then yeah, that does go on your system. It's all on your system, but that's raised as a case. And again, if you were to have too many cases, it can have consequences for your policy. There's no claims bonus or anything in indemnity. It doesn't work like that. If you had, like, everyone's entitled to have one or two hiccups in their career, Erica, but it's the law of averages. The more you practice, the more likely you are something's going to go
If
wrong.
it
No
hasn't
one,
happened, you haven't done it enough,
that's
right?
exactly right. So no one's
Yeah.
going to hold that against you. Or if you haven't pushed a root in the sinus, you just haven't pushed a root in the sinus yet. It is an inherent risk of extracting upper molars, right? So you're not going to get a loaded premium because you pushed a root in the sinus. That would be perverse. That's not. But if you kept getting complaints and you kept getting sued and the policy kept having to kick in, then yeah, you will get a loaded policy. And if you think about it, that's fair, because how indemnity works is everyone pays their premium and it goes in a bucket of trust. Because you have to know that if you get sued, there's going to be enough money in the bucket to pay for that. If one person's taking big slurps out that bucket, everybody else has got to put more money in. So there's a tipping point, isn't there, of fairness. Everyone's allowed to have a few, splashes in the bucket. It's a shared bucket. But if
Mhm.
you're deep diving in that bucket all the time,
Just
then
chugging at it.
that's
Yeah.
right. If it's like a chug, then then it's only fair. Does that
Yeah.
answer your question, Erica? Because I know it's
Yeah.
something that people, they worry that
Mm.
they ring up and that we're there and we've got, like, we're making a mark. It doesn't
Mm.
work. Yes, we have to document it, because it's really important that we document the advice that we're giving, because we're liable for that. If I give you bad advice, that's on me. That's not on you, darling.
Absolutely. No, why I wanted to ask that is because I think it's perhaps a fear. Again, there's a lot of fear being a new grad, and it's the whole like, oh, I don't want to get in trouble, or I don't want them to then dob on me, or
No.
I don't want that to go on my record. And I think the last thing we would want is the fear of that stopping people from reaching out.
Absolutely. And the dobbing thing's a really interesting point because dental legal consultants like me, there's something actually written. I told you about how the law's bricks. There's actually a brick that says if you work as an advisor like I do, you are exempt from any notifications to dob. So I actually cannot make mandatory notifications. There's a little brick that says, otherwise you could never speak to me safely. There's only 2 exceptions to that. What do you think the exceptions would be? Think about it.
Of where you have to,
Where I'm compelled to.
I guess, like criminal
Yeah. So
actions.
criminal actions. But there's 2 in particular.
I'm just thinking of specific, like criminal actions. I guess like sexual
Yeah.
encounters.
And even then, if a mere suspicion isn't sufficient, but if you ring up and you tell me that you've sexually assaulted this number of people, then that would be something that, but there's one in particular. What's pretty much the worst thing any human can do to another human?
Like kill them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's where the standard is. So think about it. So unless you're ringing up to tell me that you are the latest serial killer, if you're ringing up to say, I keep breaking files in molars, Annalene, I just don't know what to do, I will just help you with that. I'll help you find some education. I'll give you some support. No one's sniggering. No one's putting a black mark against your name. What is the point of having an advisory service that you can't ring for advice? Does that help?
Yeah, for sure. It also gives some reassurance, right? Like, unless you're a murderer, right?
All
Then
right.
Annalene's not going to dob on you.
Absolutely.
But
And Annalene
you'd
kind of
hope that she.
can't. And that's as well the really interesting
Mm.
thing, mental health issues, because I know that this is a huge barrier for practitioners seeking help because they're worried that their doctor's going to report them or that we're going to report them as unfit to practice. That's not the case. Health issues are private. They're your own. We'll help you find support. But if you ring up and you say, Annalene, I've got ADHD and it's really affecting how I practice, I'll actually support you through that and get you some support. I won't be on the phone to AHPRA. And incidentally, AHPRA wouldn't be that worried about it if you had ADHD. If it was affecting your ability to practice, they would just want to see that you had appropriate support to make sure it didn't affect your ability to practice.
There's a lot that comes with leaving university and properly adulting that no one really prepares you for. As a new grad with an income and newfound responsibilities we don't know what to do with, managing finances can be really tough. That's where JS Medical and Dental Finance comes in. Specializing in financing options tailored to medical and dental professionals, JSMDF is a completely independent broker dedicated to finding the best bank and lender for your unique situation. Led by the incredible Jason Savage, who personally came to my rescue and worked his magic and helped me secure a loan before I even started working, JSMDF is committed to supporting you throughout your personal and professional journey in whatever way you need. Whether you're looking to buy a house, a car, a practice, or pay off that year-long CPD course you signed yourself up for, JSMDF offer comprehensive advice tailored to your short and long-term plans. Their goal is to be with you from day one and thoroughly understand your financial needs and provide solutions that best work for you. And so if you're looking for some advice or you simply want to explore your options, get in touch with Jason and his team. A big thank you to JSMDF for helping make being an adult that extra bit easier and for supporting the graduate dentist community. We've gone through, I guess, breaking down in terms of what can happen from, a minor complaint to when it can get escalated, kind of hopefully giving people a bit of reassurance as to, relativity and the true seriousness of things and the percentage of things that actually become major problems and whatnot. But let's try giving, I guess, our audience and our listeners some, I guess, like actionable steps or like key takeaways on how they can best minimize the risks in their day-to-day practice.
Absolutely. I'd
And
love
like
to
what
do
are
that.
and what are common, I guess, pitfalls that you see, particularly for young and new practitioners, that you think building good habits early on will help, minimize those risks?
Absolutely. Before we do, there's one last
Yeah.
thing I want to touch on, if that's okay.
Absolutely. Go
And
for
that's
it.
the
Yeah.
third type of complaint. And it's the
Oh, did I
one
not go into it?
that
Okay,
you
sorry.
guys fear the
Yeah.
most.
Okay, yeah.
but it's in many ways the least likely to happen, and that's being sued.
Yeah.
It's really hard to get sued. To get sued as a health practitioner, you have to either have done something that you shouldn't have done or not done something that you should have. And the patient has to have suffered significant compensable harm. So I'm talking about you're doing a root canal, you don't put rubber dam on.
Mm.
The patient inhales an endodontic file.
Mm.
Was there something you should have done there?
Mm.
Yep. Has the
Mhm.
patient suffered harm? Yep. And then they end up having to have a lobe of their lung removed as a consequence.
Yeah.
And now they're permanently impaired.
Yeah.
That would be considered negligence, and it would be appropriate for that patient to be compensated. Okay. Those things are much, much rarer than AHPRA notifications. And AHPRA notifications are much, much rarer than just standard patient complaints. And everything starts as a complaint, generally. Generally, everything starts as a patient raising concerns. So going back to your question, what can we do? There's a couple of things. The first thing is it's really important how we communicate with people before we touch them. So the things when a patient comes in, it helps if we're running on time, helps if we're polite in the way that we meet them. It helps if we communicate well with people. There's a lot of evidence that patients don't sue practitioners who are really good communicators. And in fact, there's some evidence. One of my favorite studies is they listened to audio tapes with all the words taken off. And it was just the tone of the practitioner's voice and its rise and fall and how often they paused and whether they interrupted the patient. And in 1,200 tapes, the people who were doing the research could accurately predict whether the practitioner had been sued or not. So speaking with people, not over people, not interrupting is huge. It's a huge, huge, huge one. It's called active listening, so actually paying attention to our patients, having conversations with them. Don't underestimate the communication before you touch someone, including that really important conversation of consent. Because you need to remember that everything you tell a patient before something goes wrong is an explanation. Everything you tell a patient after something goes wrong is an excuse. Okay? So if something's going to go wrong, warn the patient. Root in the sinus, really good example. This is our x-ray. When we have a look, can you see this is the floor of your sinus? And it looks like the roots of the tooth are actually in the sinus. Now, they're probably not, because this is a 2D representation of you and you're three-dimensional. Probably the legs are wrapping around the sinus like this. But sometimes when we try and take the tooth out, the tooth can break. And when we're trying to get the broken bits out, a little bit can jump up into the sinus. And if that happens, then these are the things that we're going to do. Now, young practitioners worry because they worry that the patient's going to freak out. And it's about learning the right way to explain it. And I'd encourage any of you to speak to some of the more experienced practitioners in your practice to find out how they explain things, because it's a balance between giving the risk appropriately without terrifying people. Then you could die.
Yeah.
And then and if a
Yeah.
patient says, I don't want to have that, I want to go and see the specialist, don't feel
Yeah.
bad. Just go,
Mm.
amazing, I've dodged a bullet.
Awesome.
Because,
Yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. So communicating with people, particularly before something goes wrong, then it's essentially doing the right treatment to the right person at the right time. And again, I know that sounds really obvious. I say to all my patients, because I am still in practice on weekends with all my spare time, I say to patients, I know why I think you're here. Why do you think you're here today? And they normally laugh and they tell me why they think they're here. And you will be amazed how many people think they're here for something different to what you think, particularly if you're sharing patients between the clinic. So I could think that they've been booked in with me for some restorations, but they could think that they're there for an extraction or for a crown. And then you've got to start working that out. And isn't it lucky I didn't put anesthetic in? And then doing the best treatment that you can. That's a gimme. Being honest with patients when things don't go as well as you'd like. Now, this is something that I was really bad at as a junior practitioner. And I say bad at because I used to say everything was terrible. "Oh, I'm just not sure this denture's the way I wanted it to be. Oh, I'm just not sure." And it was my anxiety pouring onto the patient. That doesn't help either. You've got to remember that accepted practice is it functional? Does it fit? Does it look okay? The right color, roughly? It does. And then best practice is something completely different, or gold standard practice. We always aim for best practice. And if you miss, chances are it's not. It's still well above accepted practice. But if, for example, you've left an open contact, and it's a real bummer because that 7's drifted distally since you had those MO and DO amalgams, which had basically crapped out the cavities. And when you took them out, the contact point was huge. You could have driven a bus through it. It's going to be real difficult to get the same contact for that patient. Tell them. Explain. With passage of time, these amalgam fillings have moved together and they've kissed and they've pushed that tooth back slightly and it's left a bigger gap. And I've done my best, but you might find the space is bigger than you used to. And if you're getting food packing, we'll revisit it and you show them how to use Pixters and just explaining, because otherwise, if they're finding they're getting food packing around your filling, they can only think one of two things. Oh, this is a natural consequence of the fact that previous filling was 25 years old, or Annalene's an idiot. That dentist is an idiot. Do you see what I mean? So you step that off. So telling them if something's gone wrong is really important. And if something has gone wrong, even if it was a known risk that you discussed with them before, so using the root and sinus again. So Steve, I'm going to just stop the procedure. You remember we talked about the possibility that a piece of tooth could break off and go into the sinus. Well, unfortunately, that has happened. So this is what's going to happen next. And going on that journey with them, making sure that they're safe, that they understand, all their questions are answered, and that they get to the right place. So essentially, they need to go to the max fax or somebody to get that assessed. That's where you need to get them to. Probably wouldn't charge them that day. I did, however, successfully remove most of the teeth, so I'm still going to try.
We'll charge 80%, right?
Yeah.
To get 80% on there.
Yeah, probably not. Going to just as a little word to the wise.
I think so, yeah.
And then following up with them afterwards. So just making sure, ringing them the next day, doing a TLC call. Steve, are you okay after that extraction? Helping them get the appointment. I mean, I'm lucky because I've been around a long time, and because of the nature of the work I do, everyone owes me a favor, right? So I would just ring the max fax and say, hi, I've just pushed a root when the patient's in the room. I've just pushed a root in the sinus. Steve's right here. What can we do? And normally if the max fax is in their rooms, they'll say, I'll send him straight down while he's numb. So I'm lucky like that because I do have that. And developing good relationships with specialists, which does take time. Referring to the same people. I have heard stories of recent graduates working out how many times you have to refer a patient to get a Christmas gift, and only referring that number of times and then referring to another max fax and another max fax. Yeah, no. Have a couple because you need your main one and you need a backup, right? But developing a good relationship, going and meeting them. I know all my specialists. I've rung up, checked it was an appropriate time to go and see them, and I've gone to their rooms and met them. Said to them, are my referrals okay? Is there any more or less information that you need? Would it be helpful if I took these x-rays? My orthodontist that I refer to, is it helpful to you if I get, because I can only take OPGs at my practice. So is it helpful to you if I also get a lateral calf for every patient or just some patients? Or do you want to tell me and I'll refer for it? So just getting that information to ensure continuity of patient care, so good relationships with specialists. The next level is writing down both what you said and what you did. So as proceduralists, we're amazing at writing down what we do, terrible at writing down our discussions. And when I'm defending you, Erica, I'm not defending you on whether or not you pushed the root in the sinus or took the tooth out. It's self-evident. It's the conversations that occurred. Yeah. There are lots of ways of doing that. We have lots of resources about doing that. AI is going to become a big player in the space about doing that, though that's still yet to be tested, and the veracity of that is to be tested. So whether or not AI records are accepted at law, I don't know. I'll let you know as soon as I know. The way I write my records is I don't. My dental assistant writes my records while I'm talking, and she types away. She's an absolute legend. And then I check them at the end, check that the conversations are accurate, edit them, press enter. So those are some basic things I think that we can do to safeguard themselves. And then if a patient does complain remember, any patient who takes the time to complain to you has just given you a gift, because they've given you the opportunity to resolve it without the involvement of any third party. And I know it's painful. I know it feels really scary, but that's why people like me exist. That's my reason for being, is to help you through that and get a soft landing for you and the patient. Does that
Mhm.
answer your question?
Yeah, I actually really like your final comment about that being a gift because it is a second chance, essentially,
Absolutely.
for you to resolve that before it becomes something bigger. And yeah, when I was having this conversation with my boss, he always says, like, problems and challenges are just gifts that life has given us for us to grow and to learn from. And I think as practitioners, yeah, oftentimes it is frustrating when you have a patient that comes back unhappy or a patient that comes back, with a complaint. But I think those are the moments where we are truly tested and forced to become better as well. Because you think about, I don't actually think I've shared it on the podcast, but I was talking to my boss about these stories about how, you know, I had a patient who we actually just did a follow-up call for, and I think I'd called we had a quiet day, it was my receptionist and I, and we're saying, "Oh, let's go through some of these patients who we haven't, heard back from," and well, some of them will give TLC calls, others just seeing how they're going along with their journey, and just touching base, and we had 10 patients that we wanted to call, 9 of them we called, and they're all really happy, really grateful that we'd called them, some of them were booked back in for treatment, and we called this one patient, and my receptionist talking to her. I was just watching my receptionist's face the whole time, and I just saw it start off really happy, like, "Hello, so and so. Oh, I'm sorry you felt. Oh, okay, I'll let her know. Oh, I'm really sorry." And then she just looked at me with wide eyes and was like, "Oh my goodness, like, what's happened?" And the patient had said how, we'd done a full mouth debridement for her perio treatment, and she just said that she'd had such an awful experience, right? And, at that time, we hadn't thought much of it. We'd gone through it, we talked about it, she'd consented, she was fine throughout the appointment. She talked about being really numb, but at no point did she seem overly distressed or overly upset by it. She'd walked out smiling, okay, very numb, like, had just had a full mouth debridement. But it wasn't until we'd followed up with her a little while later that she said it was such an awful experience. Yeah. And um, I thought about it in that moment. I wonder, had we not called her, I think one of my DAs was like, "If we shouldn't have called her." And then we would have never, had this whole issue and this stress. But like, had we not called her, we would have never have known. And I wonder how many of my other patients have had less than pleasant experiences who just haven't come back, who haven't complained, have just decided to go to another practice or go to someone else and let someone else treat them. But it's the ones that actually come back and give us feedbacks, the ones that come back and actually make a complaint, that it forces us to step up and to
Absolutely.
improve our standard of care and treatment.
And they become your best patients and your best
Yeah.
referrers. Anyone that you've had a
Mm.
difficult experience with. Um,
Mhm.
I have a heart sync patient, and we all have heart sync patients. This particular person I've lost more sleep about than I think any other human in the world. And they're just difficult. They're just difficult to treat. They have difficult. They have difficulties in opening. They have tongue the size of Texas and all these other things. And we had a few bumpy appointments at the start. And I used to dread them coming in, and I used to have to see my day book in advance, because if they were coming in and I weren't expecting it, I remember one infamous day I burst into tears. And this isn't as a recent graduate, incidentally. This is recently. This person is just, for some reason, they cause me more stress than anybody else. But because we'd gone through that together and all those things, and because we'd worked it out between us and talked about why they found the treatment so difficult, and I talked about the physical issues with treating this person, we've reached a real place of understanding, and they've become my best patient. And I'm terribly fond of them. I still hate treating them, interestingly. It still makes me really nervous, but I'm really grateful that they put their trust in me,
I have the same kind of patients that you love as a person, but you just hate treating them.
because they're stressful,
Yeah,
very much so.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I mean, one thing that I wanted to end on is, obviously you are quite passionate about the mental health space. It's something that I am as well. It's something that we advocate for a lot on the podcast. And you mentioned that a lot of the calls that you receive are from practitioners in acute distress.
Absolutely.
And you're talking them off of the edge.
Absolutely.
Okay? What do you say to these clinicians? And what advice do you have for our listeners, for our audience, for our graduate dentists when they're in these scenarios where they're just really stressed, they're catastrophizing, they're freaking out? How do you manage it?
It depends, because catastrophizing is something which is you deal with slightly differently. But I think the first thing is I've let them talk, because talking is a really important part of processing. So I let them talk and I listen. I tell them it's okay, because it is. So I offer them reassurance. I find out what the things they're most worried about are, because those are the things that we need to address. Because if someone's really worried they're going to get sued, we need to talk about litigation process. Even if they're not going to get sued, I need to afford them that time. Otherwise, that concern is not going to resolve. I find out if they've got any support and who they're with, and if they're going to be alone. And if they are going to be alone, we talk about who they could talk to. It's alarming how many practitioners will go through something like litigation or a patient death and never tell anyone, partly because of shame, partly because of fear, partly because they don't want to talk about it. And I strongly would say, if you're going through a stressful time, please don't go through it alone. Because while you can ring me and you can ring my colleagues and you can ring your confidential counselling service, there really is no substitute for people who love you, and they do love you, and they are going to support you through whatever it is. I remember, as an aside, when I told my mum that I was really struggling to be a dentist and I was really unhappy and I hated it, and I hate it every day, and I didn't want to do it anymore. And I was the first person in my family to go to university and get a degree, and not just that, then to become a doctor. A huge deal for my mum. She'd be dining out on that, bless her. And it was really difficult conversation. And I was shocked, if I'm honest. Much as my mum loves me and supports me, she was so cool about it. She was so cool. Because, it was pretty obvious I was miserable, right?
Mhm.
Surprise!
Yeah.
And that level of support really made me feel like I could do anything and that I could cope with anything. Never underestimate the power and support of people who care about you. And you'd be surprised who does care about you as well. Your dental assistant likes you much more than you think they do. Your principal, you've mentioned your principal several times. I am so glad that you are in a supportive environment with a supporting principal. Again, cannot underestimate the importance of a mentor. Having someone to talk to and bounce cases off is super important. We'll let the practitioner know the solution or the end point. Often I'll start at the end and I'll actually say I'm going to start at the end, because what they want to know is, what do I do next? And then I come back and I backfill all the other stuff, because until I get to this point, they can't hear because they're so
Yeah.
stressed.
Yeah.
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 And then we'll talk about, it's okay. It's okay to make a mistake. We don't like making mistakes. We generally, most practitioners are rubbish at failing, because most of you have never failed anything in your lives.
Mhm.
Didn't even fail your driving test. You've all got straight A's. That's right.
Yeah.
So the first time you fail is when a patient complains or one of your fillings drops out, and you don't have those emotional capacities to be able to deal with that, because you've never
Mhm.
had to do it before. So you've got to learn real fast. I mean, myself and my colleague Colin, who's one of the other dental legal consultants for dental protection, we're big advocates for something called safe failing. So it's putting yourself in an environment where you experience failure all the time. He and I have both chosen to do that through the field of martial arts.
Oh,
One
the
of us,
karate?
yeah, one of us is a black belt, a second dan
Yeah.
black belt. One of us isn't.
Mm.
I'm the one who isn't.
But
And
we're on our way to a purple belt, right?
that's right.
Yes. Yes.
Hopefully, I really hope so. So I get to fail at the
Mhm.
dojo
Mm.
every day in
Mm.
a safe environment. I learn humility at the dojo every day. And it's good, because it helps you deal with other challenges. So we'll go through all those things. I'll have, like I say, I'll make sure they have support. I'll put them through to the confidential counselling service or give them the details. There are also online groups. So you'd be aware of the Mental Block, which is the Facebook group. I'm one of the administrators on that. You're probably also aware of Mindful Smiles Hub. Matt Hopcroft is the face of that, but I'm one of the people who worked on that and helped develop the resources and still do. So those kind of resources are also available for people. So we make sure people, and then the dental protection page has got a load of stuff on it. So we just make sure people know where to go. And then we end the conversation making sure that that practitioner has clarity about what they need to do next, because that's really important. And then always letting them know that they can come back to us. You mentioned catastrophizing. That's an interesting one because when people are catastrophizing, what you actually have to do is let them go to the worst case scenario. What's the worst thing that could happen? And you hear what their worst thing is. And normally it's being struck off. And then you can start there and wind them back. As I said to you, these are the odds, these are the percentages. And then when they see it, then they can, a lot of things have got to go wrong before you get to that point. So those people we wind back. A lot of people, they can be giving themselves a really nasty self-talk. I'm a terrible clinician. I really hurt this person. What was I thinking? I'm just stupid. Now with those people, you need to say, you're a good person. You're a good practitioner. You're a carer. It's okay. I actually, this morning, just before we hopped on, I have a clinician who's made a mistake. And the patient had complained. They're no longer at the practice. And they'd approached it from the position that the patient was wrong and they were riding a little bit high in their saddle. And then the x-rays came through and I heard nothing from this clinician. And so I sent the email and said, regretfully, the x-rays show this. I'm sure you've seen them. And then I got a really impassioned email overnight, absolutely devastated. So I had to spend this morning saying to that patient, that practitioner, you did your best. Sometimes things are just hard. That is not what defines you. What defines you is what you do now. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So much of it is just being human, I realize. And I hear this from you, Annalene. This whole conversation I feel like has been like a warm hug. It is how I feel. I feel like just listening to you talk before, I'm like, oh, I feel like Annalene's giving me a virtual hug.
Well, I'm glad you feel that way because it's a really
Yeah.
important part of
Mm-hmm.
what we do and what we stand
Mm-hmm.
for. But also, we talk about values. It's a really important thing about who I am because I would
Mm.
hate to think that any practitioner, particularly a recent graduate, would be frightened to call, would be
Mm-hmm.
frightened of judgment or
Mm-hmm.
of repercussion. I would hate to think that they didn't feel safe in the space of talking with us because I promise you, my darling, there's nothing that
Mm.
you can do that I haven't done. Like, I've been a dentist
Yeah.
for 25 years. I've had
Yeah.
some pretty bad days at the office, okay? And that's
Yeah.
okay. That's
I
okay.
wanted to ask you one more question, Annalie, because you work in this space and you talk so many dentists off of the ledge,
Mhm.
right? And I imagine it is a lot of, I guess, like an emotional dump or emotional burden on you as well, in the same way that as dentists, we take a lot of that from our patients. They unload all their
Absolutely.
trauma from the moment that they walk in. I hate coming to the dentist. This is my, experience from childhood. This happened, and then this dentist did this, and then this happened, and blah, blah, blah. And they go on and they tell you about everything. It's a lot, right? And so, what advice do you have on managing all the emotional aspect of dentistry?
That's a great question, Erica.
Mm.
I think it's really good to care and be compassionate, but what you have to remember is that it's not your gum disease. And you're not the person who hurt that person in the past. And even if you are, and they've had a bad experience, like your perio patient, it's an interesting, when you were talking about that, I was thinking she was too numb. Imagine if she'd been not numb enough, what her experience would have been, you see, but you can't say that, right? So it's about understanding people's perspective. But when people do come and they unload on you, you need to remember that that's not, you didn't do that. That's not your disease. That's not your perception. That's not you. All you can do is help that person moving forward. So in my role, I'm actually a conduit because you have to pass through me to get to other things, and I will push other things towards you. But I can't walk in your shoes. I can hold your hand, but I can't walk in your shoes. And I think we need to stop making ourselves responsible for people's diseases because it is their disease. All we can do is give them the options and the doors to walk through. We can't push them through, can't drag them through. We can't make them do it. We can't help them afford it. Um, we can give them discounts to make things more affordable. But again, watch that Cartman triangle because anyway. Um, but yeah, I just think That would be my best advice. And also never stop talking. We at Dental Protection, we defrag as a group about the stressful things that have happened. And that's really important because I don't know if you've read any of the work from the Resilience Shield, a guy called Dr. Dan Pronk.
I
He's
have heard Dr. Danforth.
yeah,
I've heard him give a webinar before, sorry, an in-person talk before.
he's
Yeah.
awesome. I mean, as soon
Yeah.
as you start putting the words SAS emergency physician in a sentence, you're just creating a whole type of person there, aren't you?
Yeah.
But in the resilience shield, you might remember this, Erica. They talk about how important it is to talk to family and friends, but also how important it is to have your tribe. And your tribe are the people who understand how it feels to be you because they do the same job as you. Because much as your mum or your partner loves you, they don't know how it feels to push a root in the sinus. And that's why your tribes are talking to your colleagues is really important as well. And that's why stuff like the stuff that you do, Erica, is so amazing because you need to be able to talk to each other because only you know how it feels to be a recent graduate. Even people like me, while I've been one, I had different issues. I got my first mobile phone the year I graduated, and it was the size of a brick. You know, it's a different world, mate. So talk to your friends, talk to your tribe. That would be my advice.
It's funny that we share this. One of the things that I love with the podcast is that I feel like these conversations that I have always tend to build upon one another, and they
Yeah,
often are
they would.
reflected in the conversations that I have. I was talking to one of my friends the other day about the same idea about how, you know, unless we open up and we share our experiences, it's hard for other people to fully appreciate it because they haven't been through that journey with you. So, whilst you can say, yeah, I had a crap day, they don't really understand the nuances of why that day was terrible. But when you have your tribe with you and you say like, "Oh, I had a crap day because I had a root in the sinus," every just that one sentence is enough for people to really resonate and relate to you in the same way that your wins and your successes, right?
Absolutely.
They can really feel like wholeheartedly share that joy with you because they understand how much effort or how much hard work and all the things that had to line up in order for you to achieve that. So I think, yeah, absolutely, like what you said, it's being open, it's being vulnerable, it's openly sharing all of these stories.
Definitely. And I think sharing your wins is really important from a different perspective because in order to not burn out and not have mental health distress, if you can build resilience, but building resilience takes time. You've already touched on this. No rain, no flowers. You're not going to build resilience unless you're faced with adversity. It's the only way that you can grow as a person. But also, it's very, very easy to get sucked into just looking at all the things that went wrong. And if you were to imagine a pair of scales, so you're one patient who didn't like it. Don't forget the 9 who thought you were amazing. Yeah? So, and you still helped her. She just didn't like it. And that can be really hard sometimes. But if you look, you will always remember the one time, the one patient but you'll always forget the thousands of patients you've successfully numbed up or successfully extracted teeth. So don't let that one person overwhelm or overshadow what is actually a successful career and all these other people that you are helping. And I think that's just a frame of mind. That just takes time.
Hmm. Absolutely. Thank you, Annalene,
That's
for
okay,
the warm
lovely.
hug and for such a soothing and wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure our listeners will take a lot away from it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Erica. And I'm obviously delighted that you asked me to be involved because I'm a great lover of what you do. You know, we at Dental
Yeah,
Protection are huge advocates of you and what you do. And it's just lovely to be able to share this information with you. And I hope it's helpful to someone.
absolutely. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of the Graduate Dentist Podcast. I really hope you've taken something valuable away from this episode and that you feel heard, you feel seen, inspired, and optimistic about our journey as graduate dentists. As I always say, we're in it together, so let's spread the word, let's share the love, send this to your friends, your colleagues, and those who are on a similar path who you feel may benefit from being part of the community. I'd love to hear your thoughts, so send me a message, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks' time for another episode.